Good morning. There we are. Sorry about that. Technical difficulties. Please stand by. We are moving forward. Hello and welcome to Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Gita. Today I'll be speaking with Dr. Grant Havers, chair of the philosophy department at Trinity Western University, about the crisis in Toryism that's happening both north and south of the border throughout all of Anglo-America. We'll talk about that. And in the second half, Stop the Sprays BC's Jordan Steidle joins us to discuss forestry. A big report came out saying that, hey, after you clear cut, maybe you shouldn't spray down all of the deciduous trees. You might need those later, and the toxins are way too high. So we're going to talk about that then. So remember to like the Western Standard on Facebook to be notified when I'm live. And all of us are live here at the Western Standard. Subscribe to support our content. We're not the CBC. We don't get big checks from the Liberals. I don't know why. You'd think they'd like to send us big checks too, but for some reason they don't. The big news at the federal level today is that Quebec has decided it can unilaterally change the Canadian Constitution. Of course, the habitants would say they are only trying to amend their own constitution, simply taking the law in the direction the facts already point. We are a French culture, a French nation. Why not simply codify this reality into the constitution of the Quebecois province? Well, or the beautiful province, La Belle Province. But this isn't Nam. This is Canada, and there are rules dating all the way back to 1867 and the British North America Act. Languages in Canada, that is to say French and English, enjoy equal protections under the law, and it is a legal requirement that people be able to receive services as well as conduct business in either official language of Canada. That's the bedrock of federalism, along with travel, which is an interesting point with COVID because of travel restrictions. You've just ruined federalism, let alone religious freedom, which was another bedrock of federalism. I can't really blame the Pepsis for pulling this stunt. Premier Legault, a kind of center-right populist character who helped found Air Transat, this Trumpian move was right up his alley. There's no question. And I'd be disappointed, actually, if he didn't try to make such a play for power. But what's deeply disappointing is that all the federal leaders have become so afraid of Quebec, even the Tories won't utter a peep. It's another blow to O'Toole's integrity, that is to say, the leader, Aaron O'Toole. How long he'll be leader, I don't know. But fresh on the heels of his betrayal of the base when it came to the carbon tax and the fact that he would impose a more complicated system that would end up with a Canadian Tire money account on the side. Conservatives used to be the moral conscience of the nation. As they were shut out of power for so long, they developed a reputation for citing liberal excesses and advocating for more equitable or at least fiscally responsible policy. Today, they're just out there to buy votes, the same as every other party. We in the West might enjoy changing the Constitution as we see fit, discarding equalization and making the Senate equal come to mind, but we are also believers in law and order. As St. Thomas More well said, it does us no good to remove every law to get at the devil, for what laws would hold him back from trying to get me if they were all gone. Peace, order, and good government are as Canadian as maple syrup. What Quebec is proposing is fundamentally unjust as well as anti-democratic. Our leaders need to call it what it is. Unfortunately, courage is in short supply. So to comment on that a little bit and tell us what's going on when it comes to both Canadian Toryism and Toryism around the world, we're bringing on Dr. Grant Havers. Dr. Grant Havers, it's good to have you on the program. What is going wrong with Toryism in Canada?
Good to be here. Well, the Quebec question has always been perhaps a thorn in the side of the Conservative Party, at least since the time in which the Tories hanged Louis Riel. And of course, there are a lot of historical details to that event. But the Tories have rarely been able to make a breakthrough into Quebec. I think partly because, rightly or wrongly, the Tories have always been perceived as an Anglo party or majority Anglo party, and therefore that invites or provokes suspicion from les Québécois. But Quebec is a real challenge to the Tories and obviously to anybody who believes in federalism the way you appropriately described it. Let me put it this way. Canada is a liberal democracy or a constitutional self-government, whatever term you want to use. And one of the most basic principles to that kind of regime is equality before the law, that all human beings, at least all rational adult human beings, are supposed to be equal before the law. So what that means uh, regarding federal provincial relations is that one province cannot have more power than the other, or the citizens of one province cannot have more rights than the other. So I would think, from a traditional conservative perspective, it's very hard to reconcile equality before the law as a principle with the principle that some groups or some provinces have more rights than others. I don't see how that contradiction can be addressed by any political party. So that's always been a challenge in the history of Canada, and certainly a challenge to the Conservative Party.
And going all the way back to the founding of Canada and the negotiations and the horse trading that was happening to get this nation off the ground. Something that needs to be highlighted here too is that while it was always acknowledged that Quebec was going to be different, and of course it was a Catholic and French nation inside of the rest of Canada, that was understood from the very beginning as this populace would be a nucleus and it would be different, and it was never going to be completely amalgamated into Anglo Canada, and certainly Anglo-Protestant Canada, and Orangeman Canada, which was pretty strong in certain parts of Toronto, what's now known as Toronto today. The problem, though, is that it's one thing to acknowledge those things. It's another thing for either side to put their thumb on the scale. What do you think is happening here? Why is Legault making this move? Does he just see an opportunity, or has Quebec really gotten to the point where it's so arrogant it thinks, no, I can just get away with whatever I want. No one's going to stop me?
Well, Legault's move is just the latest chapter in a history of Quebec, or at least governments in Quebec, acting on their own or acting as if they are already a nation state. And I don't mean that as a criticism. I can understand why many Quebecers feel that way. I mean, this goes as far back as Duplessis, who certainly believed in federalism more so than many of his successors. But even Duplessis thought that Quebec was separate but equal, but separate nonetheless, and acted as if the federal government was secondary to the decisions that Quebec ought to make. So this is just the latest development in a history of Quebec going its own way. I should add, too, that I don't think the Liberals have any magic solutions to this problem. I mean, Pierre Trudeau the Elder, thought, of course, that if the country became officially bilingual, or if there was equal protection of both languages, both French and English, across Canada, then somehow that would neutralize the separatist threat in Quebec, but also reassure Quebec about its place in the rest of Canada. And it seems to me that most Quebecers, certainly those who lean towards sovereignty or sovereignty association, could care less about bilingualism. That was an irrelevant answer to this problem. So I just think that whoever's in power in Ottawa, whether liberal or conservative, Quebec will continue to go its own way.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand. Something that's kind of needs to be clarified is particularly, I think, the issue of the Tory response to this. So the obvious players played into what Legault was doing. I mean, Trudeau was never going to counter Legault. He needs those seats in the coming election. Neither was Jagmeet going to counter Trudeau, at least as far as I know. His statement hasn't countered him. Nobody is going to counter him. And then it came down to the Tories. So the Tories, why did they not do what they've done many times before? I mean, they were kind of the conscience of the nation for all those years. They were shut out between Diefenbaker and finally Mulroney, and even from Mulroney to Harper. The Tories, the right wing parties of this country, kind of developed their understanding around, hey, we are going to we are, at least, if we can't have power, then we're going to be a loyal opposition that at least points out that there are things about this country that need to be protected, and we're not going to allow them to be trespassed. And now Aaron O'Toole has betrayed that legacy by saying, no, these equal protections don't matter to me. So apparently he's vote buying as well.
Right, and that's a very dangerous tactic, because, of course, the rest of Canada, or what many Quebecers call the Rock, are not happy about that unequal treatment. But yeah, I think there are two reasons, one of which you've already hit upon. The Tories are just afraid to alienate Quebec, or to be portrayed as bigoted or xenophobic, or just insensitive. But I think the other reason, which is equally political, is that the Tories historically have sometimes enjoyed or benefited from kind of the conservative populist vote that often springs up in rural Quebec. So obviously, I'm not talking about the island of Montreal. That is Tory free. They'll never put a dent into capturing Montreal. But the Tories occasionally, certainly under Mulroney and to some extent Harper, have benefited from that populist right-wing vote. Of course, that vote is kind of a mixed blessing, because sometimes populist right-wingers in Quebec, I shouldn't say sometimes, I say most of the time, lean towards more powers for Quebec, or a greater measure of sovereignty for Quebec. So it's a mixed blessing. On the one hand, the Tories have been able to harvest votes from that bloc. On the other hand, at some point, they have to make a choice about whether they believe in federalism for everyone, or whether they're going to accommodate this populist vote in Quebec. So they're in a bit of a pickle.
I understand. I think that there's another piece to this as well, is that as the Tories kind of wrestle with their identity on this, and as Quebec asserts itself, now the West might have some questions of its own. Like, why can't they unilaterally change their constitutions? I mean, I'm sure they'd love to do something about equalization. I'm sure they'd like to do something about the Senate. Why can't the West just totally decouple itself from the consensus of 1867 or even 1982 and be like, no, you know what? Like, we run the show now, and we're going to do whatever we want to do.
Well, that's right. That's a danger facing all political parties in Canada, namely the danger of a domino effect, in which some provinces, probably the Western ones, will say, look, why can't we enjoy a measure of sovereignty, or something even more dramatic, like separation, the way that Quebec has sometimes acted, and that's a real question. I don't think the federal Liberals have an answer to that at all. They, as you know, they have a pretty poor record of understanding the West. This goes at least as far back as Pierre Trudeau. So, yeah, I think in a liberal democracy, one that is officially committed to equality before the law, any kind of double standard, especially in a time of stress and instability, will just not be tolerated indefinitely. And again, the Liberals don't have an answer to that. I don't think the Tories do either. I'm not sure that Mr. O'Toole really understands the West. I mean, you mentioned the carbon tax, the new carbon tax measure that he has proposed. So, yeah, growing Western alienation is a real thing. And unless both major federal parties can answer the question, what exactly unites us as a country, I think we're going to be facing some real turbulence and instability down the road.
I completely agree. The question, though, becomes, what would that new political arrangement look like? I never thought I'd be the guy on a show that was based on Western sovereignty. Again, as I've said many times on this show, I'm ambivalent about the question of federalism. I prefer the external borders of Canada. I think the internal borders need to change. But to that end, like I just said, I never thought I'd be the guy on a show somewhere explaining that I wanted to become Yugoslavia, but some kind of loosely confederated entity that is more like an empire with its various stretched out arms than a tightly federalized system that we've attempted for 150 years but is falling apart now. I don't know how to advocate for that without sounding insane, but I think we might need an Austro-Hungarian empire and not what we have today.
Yeah, and of course that empire had its own problems leading up to World War One, but we don't have to get into that. But yeah, I think you're right, and Canadians, especially Canadians in government, need to understand the original raison d'être of Canada. I mean, unlike the United States, we're not a country based on high principle or propositions that were immortalized, like propositional truths that were immortalized through the Declaration of Independence. Nor are we like European countries that have a very homogeneous ethnic identity that has a shared history and language that keeps the country together. We don't fit into either the European or American model. I mean, what really has historically been the basis of Canada is sound economic policy. And I think John A. Macdonald understood this very well, that it wasn't about political philosophy as in the United States, and it wasn't about homogeneous identities. It was about making sure that all regions of the country benefited economically. And that's really the glue that is supposed to keep the country together. But if certain regions of the country don't feel that Confederation benefits them in any economic sense, then we're in trouble. And again, the absence of a national narrative just adds to that uncertainty and disdain over Confederation. So again, I think the question of economics has to be addressed here.
I completely agree. And that, I think, it's pretty clear that when there are economic shocks in this country, that's when there are, even when it's economic prosperity too, but like, because I mean there was a lot of separatist sentiment during the First World War, and obviously Quebec was benefiting from the First World War. They were getting a lot of pay out of that situation, but unrest with economic uncertainty in this country is a very real thing, and COVID has not helped this, and neither has the Trudeau government.
Well, no, that's right. I mean, in the best of times, all political parties are kept together or hang together because of loose coalitions. I mean, that's true of the Liberal Party, it's true of the Conservative Party. And those coalitions, which often have different agenda, or the people making up the coalitions may have different agenda or different concerns. They only hang together if times are prosperous or if times are peaceful. But coalitions can break apart in times of anxiety and instability. So I mentioned that because the Conservative Party of Canada has always been kind of a loose coalition of small business, Western populists, obviously voting blocs in Ontario and Quebec to some extent, all of whom have different interests or may even understand conservatism differently. And again, in times of prosperity, those differences may not matter. It may not matter that there can be these differences, but in a time of instability, these coalitions are very fragile and can be vulnerable to things like separatism or just a province going its own way.
Mm-hmm. Maybe let's pivot a little bit now to what's happening in the United States. So we are now, 6 months out from the end of the Trump presidency, and so far that that was when the election was called. So we're getting towards that point now. The election having been called for Biden about a week after the or 5 to 7 days after the initial voting. The and of course, it was the Stop the Steal campaign, and then there was the January 6th riots and all that stuff. That's all starting to feel like ancient history now as we get into the end of May and into June. But within the Republican Party, it's only yesterday. So the Conservative Party of the United States, the right-wing party of the United States, is struggling to find its identity. Is it going to stick with its former president now at the Winter White House in Mar-a-Lago, taking meetings, talking with people, starting his own social media company, supposedly making statements and pronouncements, almost like an opposition leader against President Biden, which of course is different for American politics today. They don't have a parliamentary system. They have a congressional system. So the idea of there being a leader of the opposition is a very different sort of understanding there. What's going to happen to the Republican Party? Is it going to remain the party of Donald Trump, or are they going to move on?
The quick answer is who knows. But my best guess is that eventually they will have to move beyond. I guess the Trump personality cult for different reasons, but I think the Republican Party cannot move beyond the kind of populist base that was built up during the Trump era. They cannot afford to lose that base, which is largely made up of not just small business people, but also
working people who are working, and
working class Americans until the rise of Trump. So, I mean, there'll always be a wing of the Republican Party that wants to get beyond not just Trump, but also populism. But I think they'll be increasingly marginalized. And now there's talk that these more liberal Republicans or anti-Trump Republicans might even form their own party. I would say good luck with that, because there is no voting bloc in the United States that will support a breakaway anti-populist Republican Party. That idea is just pure fantasy. So I think the Republicans, just for the sake of re-energizing themselves, have to get beyond Trump, although they have to be careful about how they do that. But they have to hang on to that populist vote. They've got to hang on to the working class that voted Republican in the time of Trump. Hopefully they'll do that if they're smart.
Yeah, if they can politically strategize how to do that. But the thing is, I think that's kind of the bargain they have to make. They have to stick with the greatest showman, the man who managed to bring in these Reagan Democrats back into the party. People who felt alienated, people who, it's funny because we watch Roseanne. That's always one of my favorite references, right? There's Roseanne, right? And you're watching Roseanne, and you've got some, I guess it could have been Reagan Democrats, but definitely Clinton working class voters, right? Like they wanted, third way policies. They're working class people. They want to help their children. They want their schools to be open. And then somehow both establishments, Democrat and Republican, bought so hard into neoliberalism and shipping jobs overseas and defunding the public services that people need that it took Trump to come in and question that. Like it's kind of incredible. Even after a socialist was supposedly president, though I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization of Obama. They needed to bring in a reality TV show star to try and bring back the forgotten man speech. How did that happen, Dr. Havers?
Well, I think it happened because the Republican Party blazed a trail for Donald Trump. And I know the Republican establishment doesn't want to admit that. They don't want to admit that they're partly responsible for the rise of Trump. But like you mentioned, the Republican Party, but also the Democrats, have endorsed so-called free trade policies that didn't do much good for working class Americans. And then both parties, I'm thinking of the second Iraq War in particular, have supported imperial adventurism in foreign policy, or endless wars for democracy, which have failed. We just have to look at Afghanistan today. And of course, none of that helped to attract working class voters to the Republican Party. So Trump came in. And as you mentioned, he denounced neoliberal or free trade policies, but he's also proud of the fact that he never got America involved in another war that is costly in terms of blood and treasure. I think in one of his last speeches before he left the White House, he proudly said that hadn't got America involved in another destructive war. So I think that's why Trump was able to perpetrate this hostile takeover against the Republican Party, because the Republican establishment, I think to this day, still doesn't understand its own base. And I just find that mind-boggling. At least the Democratic establishment understands its base, which is probably why it's more successful. But the Republican establishment still seems to think that most voters want free trade policies, and there should be more intervention around the world to spread democracy. I mean, some of that sentiment has been chastened because of the Trump era, but Trump understood the base so well. And if anybody's going to replace Trump, it's got to be another populist who has his appeal, but also his animal cunning in terms of understanding what working class and small business Americans want. And I'm not sure that a replacement is in the offing.
It is a difficult task ahead. My own personal bet, and this is calling it way out. I mean, I actually called it. What was it? It was 2016. So it's 5 years ago. This May, I called Trump's election in May of 2016, and I was proven right there. Obviously, my call for it this last election cycle, though I do have some questions about where some of these votes came from, was wrong or forced to be wrong by somebody somewhere. But I think that my call now would be what's going to happen with this other run, perhaps by Trump or not. I think the Trumpian candidate is going to be blessed by President Trump. I think it might be DeSantis, the governor of Florida, who, of course, with his anti-lockdown mentality, has kind of saved his state. Between him and maybe Kristi Noem as his vice presidential pick, as kind of this bizarre pivot where all of a sudden Florida's the new California. I mean, you would remember better than I, not to mention your age, Dr. Avers, but you would remember better than I what happened. California used to be a Republican state. It used to be a strong Republican state, and then something happened to it. Is the story of California kind of the story maybe of what's gone wrong in the United States generally?
Yeah, well, Californication sweep the nation. Yeah, that's interesting. You're right. I am old enough to remember when California was reliably Republican, had a very strong economy, rooted in the manufacturing sector, which was able to lift so many working class people into the middle class. Now, as you know, it's strongly Democratic. The middle class is shrinking in California, and the big tech companies have replaced the manufacturing sector. And of course, big tech certainly makes a lot of money for itself, but doesn't produce a middle class. And in fact, is quite happy to survive on a proletariat or a precariat of workers who are not in the middle class. So, yeah, I think many Republicans fear that California is kind of a bellwether for the rest of the country. They should also be worried about Texas. I mean, Texas may be moving into the Democratic column, partly because of the immigration issue. And of course, most immigrants from the developing world generally vote Democrat. I don't think there's anything controversial about that. If the Republicans lose Texas, it's over. They will never be able to win a federal victory or a presidential victory again. So
No.
I think the more enlightened Republicans understand this, and certainly Trump did. But that's right. All it takes are a few states to go the way of California, and the Republican Party will be finished.
Yeah, that purpling. Georgia is purpled, as I think Mark Stein put it once. They're purpling in Texas. They're purpling in Georgia. What's going to happen next? Maybe kind of pulling back from all of it for just a moment is what we've been here since 2016. We're now 5 years into the disruption, the politics of disruption, as people said, that the discourses that have been disrupted, whatever projects were underway come 2015 into 2016, one way or another, things have kind of gone sideways for those ruling elites in that way for a long time, half a decade now. Brexit was that signal. So was the Trump presidency and the Trump election. Before that, we saw the unrest, the popular unrest, when it came to the austerity, both in England but also throughout Europe after the Euro crisis and the financial crisis in the United States. Why is there such a disconnect between those who are in charge and the people on the ground? And particularly if we even look at Canada, it seems to be like particularly right-wing premiers are the most disconnected from their populace. Somehow Ford is more hated than John Horgan is. Same with Kenny and Pallister, for that matter. The somehow on the right, this disruption of discourse has gotten worse. What happened globally and then maybe more locally? Why is there this disconnect?
Well, I think this disconnect goes back to the failure of some leaders on the right to understand their own voting base. So I mentioned the working class and small business people, and unfortunately, this is a pattern in the history of the right, at least recent history, with a few exceptions, that the establishment right, as I would call it, has trouble relating to the working class. Now, in fairness, I would say the federal liberals and the NDP have that problem too, which is embarrassing for the NDP because they're supposed to be the party of the working class. And the Democrats have seemed to lost touch with uh, their traditional constituency, the working class. So this is a problem that applies to all political parties. But I think in general, elites across the world, I don't just mean government elites or political ones, but also corporate elites, no longer really believe in the nation state or no longer really have local loyalties or attachments. They certainly prize social mobility. They certainly love the fact that they can move their money around the world with just a flick of the button on the keyboard. That's very different from the elites of the old days. I don't want to romanticize those days, but the wealthiest people that tended to govern Canada, the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, I think were more attached to their countries, largely because they weren't as mobile. They couldn't just move their money around. They couldn't just live wherever they liked. And so they had to demonstrate a commitment to their nations, sometimes through philanthropy or other ventures. But the elites in our own time, the managerial elites, they see themselves not as citizens, but as participants in the global village. And therefore they see nationalism as kind of a dangerous and archaic threat that should just go away. So I think in general you do have this kind of cosmopolitan attitude that we should represent the world. We should not represent our national loyalties, and of course they profit from that attitude as well. But in the process, they ignore the concerns of the working classes in their countries.
It's interesting because again, we've been through a gilded age before. We named it such. It looks like we're headed towards another one, especially with the disparity in wealth that's growing. The last gilded age, it didn't end in the same kind of destruction as previous ones did, or previous moments of disparity. I'm thinking of the French Revolution. I'm thinking of other moments in history. That gilded age, while in Europe certainly there were returns to fascism and totalitarianism, it didn't happen everywhere, and it didn't happen in the Anglosphere, which is interesting. Do you predict that we'll survive this gilded age the same way we did last time, or is there going to be a fundamental pivot to a more totalitarian style of government, even in Anglo America?
Yeah, I'm reluctant make predictions, but here's maybe a best guess. I would think the real authoritarian threat today tends to come from the left, and I wouldn't call this a left-wing version of fascism necessarily, but I think many people on the left, in forgetting uh, their their movement's historic commitment to the working class, are very comfortable with giving governments and big tech enormous surveillance powers to spy on the population and deplatform people who oppose their ideology. So I think we have a different left today that is not just cut off from the working class, but is quite comfortable with a Leviathan state that likes to monitor people and uses big tech to censor people as well. So I think that's where the authoritarianism is coming from. I mean, when was the last time that cancel culture applied to somebody on the left? I guess it happens occasionally, but as you know, overwhelmingly cancel culture applies to the right. So I would think the right uh, in in some parts of Europe or perhaps the United States has some authoritarian elements, but they're not the predominant elements of the right. I think the right is fighting a defensive war. The right is trying to preserve what is left of traditional liberties and traditional constitutional government, and they have a real uphill battle that they're fighting in the process. So the right is trying to fight for survival. I don't think that they're in a position, even if they wanted to be, to recreate the kind of mass fascist movements that characterized the 1920s and 30s. So I think the danger of, of abuse of power in an authoritarian direction is more so on the left.
So there won't be an English speaking Franco, is what you're saying.
No, I wouldn't hold my breath.
Let's talk a little bit about what is closer to home, with in particular the disconnect between the three kind of most well known right wing premiers that we have, two in the West and one in Ontario: Ford, Pallister, and Kenney. Most recently, Kenney appearing to lose control of his caucus. It appears that Kenney may very well be on his way out. It Each of these people made different decisions. They resulted in different problems. Maybe the press is scrutinizing right wing premiers more than it would left wing or conservative premiers more than it would liberal ones or progressive ones or NDP ones. But nonetheless, even I, when I'm cross examined by my friends who live in these areas, of course, we're in British Columbia. Both of us are speaking for British Columbia today. But when I talk to people who live in Alberta, Manitoba, or Ontario, they, even if they're sympathetic to, say, a conservative or PC candidate, they hate what they're living under. And I have to admit that I wouldn't have a lot of mercy on my particular leader as well if I happen to live in those districts. What has happened here? Why on the right has there been this complete disconnect with their base and ultimately a betrayal of their base? We've seen this federally already, but now through COVID, even the idea of maybe trying to use some more freedom loving sort of methods or individual sort of solutions to these problems, they've completely caved and they've lost both the people that were never going to vote for them and the people who already voted for them.
Yeah, and sad to say, this is a pattern in the history of the right on both sides of the border. A famous American conservative thinker, Wilmore Kendall, once said that the right never retrieves its wounded, which is a depressing thought to contemplate. But for a long time, the right, in a way, has been its own enemy because once right-wing parties get into power, they generally abandon the ideology that attracted voters in the first place. You can see that in the history of the American right. That once upon a time, the American right was quite opposed to interventionist foreign policies. And as we said, Trump benefited from that voting bloc. But there are many establishment conservatives who get into power and embrace interventionism. I'm sorry if I'm going back to the American context, but I remember when George W. Bush was debating Al Gore, he said America should not be a nation building nation or something like that. We should avoid that sort of thing. And then, of course, the second Iraq War came along. So you see parallels in Canada too, that often Tories or conservatives that get elected do not realize or forget about why they got elected in the first place. I mean, most people who vote on the right are sick and tired of the surveillance state. They're tired of being monitored and spied on and being deplatformed. I'm encouraged by the fact that O'Toole is making an issue out of C10, that internet bill that the Liberals are proposing that has some implications for free speech on the internet. I think they need to do more of that. And if I had any advice for conservative parties, especially the federal one, it is to present themselves as the Freedom Party, in which it's okay to have the freedom to disagree with each other. It's okay to question the government. It's okay to cherish one's liberties. I think that would be effective propaganda against the left right now. But Tories, at least Tories in our governments, have not done enough of that, and they need to do more.
And it's a communications issue as well. That for some reason they'll communicate and campaign as populists, right? And as the Freedom Party, as you just mentioned, that they'll campaign in that respect. But where is the meat of the issue? Even with Harper, the further we get away from Harper's legacy, like God bless him and everything, and I mean it's a sin to complain against Harper and Toryism. But the further we get away from it, the redder, the more red Tory his legacy gets. It wasn't actually the populist thing that everybody remembers. We still have gun legislation that he promised to get rid of. We still have a Senate that's not equal. We still have taxation that's still exorbitant. Boutique tax credits weren't going to do enough. We needed to literally cut taxes to the point where raising them again to the same rates as before would have caused a rebellion. People would have been marching in the street. But none of those things happened. Cutting the CBC didn't happen. Why don't conservatives rule as boldly as their liberal opposition?
Well, those are all valid questions. I would think, I mean, to go back to what we earlier discussed, the federal Tories are afraid of alienating Quebec. They're afraid of alienating the 905 district in southern Ontario, both of which tend to be more comfortable with an interventionist state or with a state that the federal Liberals have built up over time. And that leads to the strategy of being a Me Too liberal. I mean, there are many Tories who think that they should just abandon right-wing rhetoric altogether, or conservative policies, because they think these policies are doomed, or they're not going to get any traction in certain parts of Canada, and that's partly true. But they're not going to win if they're just a faint echo of the Liberal Party. That is even more of a losing strategy. So again, I would think that Tories, especially electorate Tories, have to build some backbone and realize that many Canadians, maybe not all, maybe just a plurality, but many Canadians want more freedom. They want the freedom to be able to disagree without losing their careers or their reputations. And again, I think Tories have to push back on the absolute intolerance that parties on the left in Canada have been manifesting for a long time. I mean, for all the talk about tolerance and diversity, generally left-leaning parties could care less about those things. They think in monolithic terms. They don't tolerate the freedom to disagree, et cetera. So I think the Tories could do a lot more, but this will take courage. And they have to realize they're going to lose some votes in the process, but so be it.
And kind of find new ones. I mean, that was the other thing that got, well, we're looking at that. We saw a turnout for the Brexit vote that we'd never seen before. And then we saw when the Tories became the party of Brexit that they were taking labor strongholds, things that hadn't changed color since the Gilded Age, since the 20s and the 30s, and the founding of the Labour Party in Britain. We saw the same thing happen with Trump. The blue wall was broken. Even this last time, whatever one wants to say about integrity, lack thereof, of the election, that was extremely close in all of those places and could have well gone the other way. This is the reality. This is the reality. There is another voting bloc out there. There's a huge amount of people out there. I mean, Trump has increased his votes by the most incumbent president of all time. Instead of going down, he went up by something like 11 million votes. And so there really is an entire other group of people out there that somehow conservatives are just not talking to. Why aren't they? Why aren't they reaching out? Why aren't they evangelizing? Why aren't they spreading the ideas of Toryism, of whether you are more on the throne and altar side, whether it is more of the commons and the common good side, or even if you are on the more classical liberal and the free market side? There's a real story and a compelling narrative, but conservatives just seem to be incapable of communicating it.
Yeah, I think it's because on both sides of the border, let's say Tories and Republicans, they're just afraid. They think the left is on the right side of history, or at least the winning side of history. And I think some Tory and Republican strategists think that that by appealing to the left, somehow that will gain them power. And I think that's pure fantasy, because generally people on the left will always vote on the left. And Tories and Republicans, like the establishment versions, need to understand that. So, you mentioned Britain and how Labour is losing the working class vote. I mean, there are politicians in Britain who believe that critical race theory is perhaps a vote getter. That by encouraging the perception that Britain is fundamentally racist, that all of its institutions are racist, that it needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, that somehow that's a vote getter. And it's not. The English working class, or the working class of the UK, generally can't stand ideologies like critical race theory. So I mean, in purely political terms, there's no point in endorsing an ideology like that in the hopes of gaining votes. But again, as you mentioned, there's this disconnect between leaders and the populist base. And I give credit to Trump for understanding that the base doesn't dig ideologies like critical race theory. It's not that we should deny the history of racism in Western democracies, but the radicalism of something like critical race theory, to say the least, is not a vote getter. So I think Tories and Republicans need to understand that by cozying up to the left, they are wasting their time. It would be far more effective to actually stick to conservative principles and win votes that way.
And I believe that a coalition there can be built. Maybe that's kind of the final point to bring up here is with Canada, again, you know, a loosely confederated entity, what that might look like, or how to appeal to all corners of that country. With the Tory ideal, I really do believe there is a way to get, maybe it can't be done in Toronto proper, but throughout the rest of Canada, there is a real possibility of building a coalition of 51% and taking Parliament and trying to reform this country. If that 51% is out there somewhere, what are the principles that you believe, Dr. Havers, that need to be put forward in order to bring them into the big blue tent and make Canada a better place?
Well, I think one principle would be to win back or at least keep that working class populist vote. And again, I fear that many elected Tories will lose that vote, partly because they'll endorse economic policies, like tax cuts for the very wealthy, that will not please that working class base. So I think they have to promote themselves more as a populist party, not in any ethno-racialist sense. I mean, that would be a disaster, but a populist party that is more conducive or more beneficial to the working class and small business vote. They need to expand their appeal on that. And I think focusing on economic issues is always a good start. Developing economic policies that will actually grow the middle class, that will bring working class people into the middle class, and at the same time hit the Liberals and the NDP hard on their ideological intolerance, on their unwillingness to tolerate the freedom to disagree. I think if you combined those principles together, you probably could get a winning coalition.
Well, amen. I mean, we can't go on like this with 1.5 parties, and we certainly can't go on with the consensus that we've had these last 100 and, well, that's what it feels like, anyways. The 88 of the 110 years, as Lord Conrad Black likes to reference all the time in his column. The Liberal consensus and the Laurentian consensus in Canada is killing Canada, to the point where even its traditional strongholds, like as we're noting now with Quebec, are rebelling. They're doing whatever they want, and they're doing it with impunity. Maybe as a final point, Dr. Havers, do you think that the Canada that we know today, do you think that will be here in 50 years?
I have no idea, but I would think that it's entirely probable that conflicts that are not just regional, but perhaps even tribalistic, will engulf Canada and certainly engulf the United States. I think the big question that conservatives on both sides of the border need to answer is what exactly unites us, or what exactly unites a majority of Americans or Canadians. If they can't answer that question, not that other parties can necessarily answer it, then we're in trouble. Because it's always been difficult for Canadians to address that question. What actually keeps the country together? And I think, among other things, a sound economy that benefits all regions keeps the country together. But I also think that if we abandon equality before the law or the rule of law, then we're not going to have a country. We're going to have
I think Dr. Havers has frozen there for a moment. He might come back. Came back a moment later. But we are going to be pivoting pretty quick here. So if that's goodbye to Dr. Havers, that will happen. While we wait just a moment for either. There we go. Hold on. Looks like you're back. You're back. Sorry, I'll have to let you repeat your point there because we lost you for a moment.
Yeah, I think the possibility of Canada and the United States splitting apart is there, as long as the economy, certainly in Canada, does not benefit all regions, or as long as economic policies do not benefit all regions. And as long as equality before the law is no longer taken seriously, as long as that situation persists, I think many Canadians will ask themselves, well, what are we? Are we a country anymore? Or does anything unite us anymore? I think these are real dangers that could lead to the splitting up of Canada.
Well, hopefully it doesn't come to that, but it may very well. And of course, this channel is dedicated to some of those questions, and we're thankful to have opinions thereof. Dr. Havers, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom with us today. We'll have you on again soon, I'm sure, to talk more to us about what's going right and mostly wrong in Toryism in Canada.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Havers. Well, we're going to spend a few minutes here kind of dwelling on what went sideways there with Quebec and some of the things thereof. And of course, we could also bring up maybe any of the other, well, any of the news items that are around those fines that people are having to pay. And supposedly they're not going to get their driver's license back if they don't pay their fine. I don't really understand how that works. But while we're waiting for Jordan Steidle of Stop the Spray to come on, he'll be on in a minute or two. He was sent his link, and he did promise for 10 a.m. So we're hopeful. But I think in the erstwhile, we need to think just loud and clear here for a moment, out loud and clear, that it really doesn't make sense that you can prevent people from exercising their basic liberties due to COVID laws, which of course aren't laws. They were written into regulations and healthcare mandates by unelected bureaucrats. I guess with the permission of their minister, perhaps their deputy minister, but nonetheless, it's hard to understand actually how anyone could think to themselves, yeah, you not wearing a mask means that not only should I fine you, but now I need to garnish your wages. I don't know what to say to that. I don't know how to respond to that. I can't even articulate an argument. What's that line from? I don't know. Is that from like Happy Gilmore or something? It's not Happy Gilmore. It feels like an Adam Sandler movie or something. What you've just said is so stupid. It has lowered the IQ of everybody in the room. I reject your hypothesis. I think that you are an abomination, and may God have mercy on your soul. I don't know whatever happened to the shaming that needs to happen of leadership. I don't know why none of our leaders seem to have grumpy uncles or grandpas who could tell them how it is and kind of maybe chastise them a bit and give them a bit of a something slap. We won't say that word here on TV, but the point is that where is the conviction? Like where did people fall off the wagon when it came to a basic sense of conscience? And it's like, no, you don't actually get to fine people for not wearing a mask. And even if you do, you don't get to withhold their wages from them. I'm sorry. Like you don't. This is nonsense. You can't take away their driver's licenses, and you can't take away their wages. This is slavery. It's a mask. Like they say, well, then just wear it. No, you just wear it. You back off. I don't understand why I'm having to articulate an argument where I'm supposed to be the subservient one. I'm the citizen. I'm a freeborn citizen in a democracy. You're the public servant, not me. Get out of my way. I don't really understand how this is even an argument, but it is. There are people who are being fined, and if you don't pay your fine, you could have your services suspended, things that you have a right to. I just don't understand it at all. Well, right on time, we have James Steidle. He is going to be on with us to tell us about Stop the Spray BC. He's been on with us before, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about a recent report that came out that spraying after logging is really bad for all of us and for the forest, and actually it's super toxic. So, James, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, Nathan. Hopefully the reception here is a little better than last week. Or the other week.
For sure. It's good to have you. Why don't you walk us through what this report was saying and what we need to understand about it?
Sure. So the report builds on some previous research that was conducted out of UNBC here in Prince George by Lisa Wood. That was published actually over a year ago. The first part of the report that basically said that the glyphosate, it goes into the roots of these herbaceous perennial plants like blueberries and raspberries, and pretty much everything else that isn't killed by the glyphosate spray. And the next year, that glyphosate will flush back out into the foliage and the berries that you will be consuming when you eat them. And so they found that out. That was published, but the new part that just came out was how long this stuff is persisting for, and I think also a little bit more detail on the levels. So a year after spraying, blueberries and raspberries have been found, about a quarter of them that they sampled had glyphosate levels that were higher than the default limit allowed in grocery stores. So these are berries, you're out in the bush picking blueberries, and they wouldn't even be allowed to be sold on the grocery store shelves. And I think that's just shocking. And I think it really opened the eyes of a lot of people who may have not taken the spray issue that seriously, because let's be honest, for decades, we've been told that the glyphosate persists for just, at the most, maybe a couple months. And the signs that they post at these places where they spray, all they say is avoid the cut block for 2 days, So, and I've been in these places and I've picked berries. I've eaten berries from these blocks, the year after spraying. So I'm like, oh yeah, I believe the science. I believed what the science said, actually. And I've always kind of looked at this more of, well, they're killing food for wildlife. I didn't really think that it was a contamination issue. Having said that, I've always noticed that the aspen trees, years after spraying, look like they're still impacted. So I always suspected there was something going on with long-term impacts on the health of a lot of these species. And I think one of the interesting things was the fireweed. Fireweed roots can actually be pretty old. I didn't quite know that. And they had the longest levels of glyphosate residue. So 12 years after spraying, the fireweed still had glyphosate in them. 12 years. So it's...
Yeah, that's not good.
No.
That's bad.
And
why are we doing this? why are we doing this? This is a terrible idea.
Oh man, just inertia, momentum, ego, pride. I'd probably say nothing to do with rationality or logic. I can guarantee you that. I mean, they just like we talked about the last show, and I don't know. I don't want to get into all this stuff again, or maybe we do. They just they've got a simplified view of the forest, and it's just like a farm, and you got to get rid of the competition, and that's still the guiding principle. And actually, since we talked last, there's been some interesting things I've discovered as far as what the industry believes. And we've got the top forester for a major company here in the Central Interior, kind of saying the exact same thing we're saying. So we can talk about that later if you want, or.
No, I am happy to bring that up now. I'm happy to wander around these questions a little bit here, there, and everywhere. One thing that actually just comes to mind here, James. I mean, my parents got a farm out west here towards Ness Lake. It's actually on Heron Lake, which is that little heart-shaped thing right underneath the lung shape of Ness Lake. But the point is, they have this spot there, and I think of how the wild, our own wildlife, that is to say the domesticated animals, the pigs, especially when they clear out the underbrush and that sort of thing. All they're doing is leaving behind fertilizer. They're not toxifying it. Why didn't people just put the animals on it to clean up afterwards if you wanted to give the saplings a fresh start or whatever? What's wrong with that? Wouldn't that just put the organic material back into the forest?
Well, there was a huge industry back in the 90s because a lot of this glyphosate spraying stuff, none of this is new, like the controversy about it. I think we're learning more about it now. But back in the 90s, there was a fair bit of opposition to spraying around Prince George. And the NDP government of the day, I think they made an effort to kind of reduce chemical use and use sheep. So there was a huge industry of sheep grazing these cut blocks to kind of clear out some of the herbaceous vegetation, without, contaminating it or poisoning it. And then, like you say, fertilizing it. And it was a great method. I think we had 30,000 sheep in BC, I think between the Peace and the Prince George area, dedicated to this program. And they were doing huge areas. And I know a couple of the grazers that are still trying to get it back on its legs. One of them is Dennis Loxton, and he actually had some contracts out in Alberta last year. So hopefully he can pick it up again. He's here in Prince George. So they had this huge industry, and then around the early 2000s, it just got shut down. And all sorts of terrible things happened in the early 2000s to forestry in this province. And I think a lot of it had to do with this kind of knee-jerk reaction to the pine beetle. And a lot of regulations were eliminated. Actually, a lot of this, I don't know if you want to talk about Kevin Falcon at all on the show here, but he's running for leader of the BC Liberals. And, he ran this deregulation ministry back in 2002, 2003. And, there's no minutes of a lot of these meetings where they talked about getting rid of the regulations. So we don't know what actually, who's responsible for what. But let's just say a whole bunch of regulations were eliminated in the early 2000s that just destroyed our forests and the forest industry, right? The pertinency was gotten rid of. The requirement to cut local logs at local mills, that went through the window. And then all of a sudden you had these big super mills, a lot of the smaller family mills, their days were numbered. We're still seeing them die off. And they basically made it way easier to herbicide spray, right? So there used to be a requirement that you had to get a registered professional biologist to sign off on spray plants. And there were some more restrictions around spraying wet areas, and a lot of this is kind of documented in this the Frog Watch director Purnima Govindarajulu's report back in 2008, talking about the impact to amphibians from forestry spraying. And they all of these easements and cutting of red tape and restrictions just made it easier and more sense for everybody just to spray with helicopters. So the sheep industry just died. Like all these guys went bankrupt. Whole herds of sheep had to be liquidated. Like the amount of sheep grazing went from thousands of hectares a year to like nothing. And yeah, that's their own fault. It's the government's fault that they allowed this to happen. There was no, when you do these kind of programs, you got to provide these people with security and knowledge that they're going to have work for 10 years. Like you can't just build up and then liquidate whole herds of sheep for this purpose. No. Right? You gotta provide some certainty in that. And the government never ensured that happened, and all the companies just did the cheapest thing. So we all went back to glyphosate spraying throughout the 2000s, and we're slowly seeing that those ideas come back again. I really want to see that happen north of town. So Canfor is going to be spraying a whole bunch again this year, northeast of town, and they're after the herbaceous threat. The fireweed, all of this huge, rich complex of herbaceous plants. A lot of like rubus, raspberry and thimbleberry species, and ferns and twinberry, elderberry. A whole bunch of really cool, important plants are just going to wipe out with glyphosate. And that's where these sheep should be going. And I've talked to Canfor. I'm like, listen, you guys made $500 million in profit this first quarter. I think it's time to spend a little bit of money on not spraying and doing something different. So that's what I'd like to see happen. And I've talked to them about it, and apparently they're going to do a couple little trial, sheep grazing things this year, but it's not enough. They got to stop spraying completely in forestry. And like you say, there's alternatives.
It's kind of incredible how those alternatives work too. It's I was raised not quite a city boy my whole life. We went hiking. We were an outdoor family, and I was raised in the suburbs of Prince George. I know it's hard for some of our viewers who are outside of Prince George to believe there are suburbs of Prince George, but there are. It's quite a spread out city, not as spread out as Lake Lahash or Chilliwack, but it's a pretty spread out city. It's a large geographic area. But the point is that I was raised out of doors for sure. But once we got on the land, which was right after I graduated from university, I really started to understand that I knew nothing about that that interrelationality between wildlife, domestic animals, and the forest and the land in general, right? And then your own effort that has to be put into it. It's all over the place. It's a lot. It's very complicated, and it's been this beautiful thing to watch my dad do some kind of heritage, both heritage animals and then heritage methods, the old homesteading methods around clearing land, putting animals on it first, and then they take out the foliage, and then that makes it easier to log if you were to hand log or select log. That was how it was done in the old days. And I don't know why we had to get away from that entirely. It definitely works, and especially with this question of reforestation and making sure that we don't spray and toxify the place. Like with mobile fencing nowadays too, with what you can do with electric fencing, like you're not going to have sheep just wandering around. Like you can keep them in very concentrated areas and they can mow down anything very quickly.
Yeah, well, I don't know if fencing out on those cut blocks would be a lot of work, but they've got sheep herding dogs that can keep them in place, and yeah, they would feed, and you can create little enclosures for them at night for sure. Yeah, and it would be easy to rig those electric fences up. It's very interesting, all of those things that you just talked about, and close to nature forestry and allowing animals and to work with us and help us out, and part of that, to go back to the whole reforestation thing, and I think the other part of that is, okay, sure, it might cost a little bit more money to do something that way. It might be a little bit more effort. You might have to even hire more people. God forbid.
God forbid.
Yeah. But we could allow more diversity in the forests as well. And I think that's the other big thing that I think gets forgotten in these discussions. And especially at a higher level in the government, all they're thinking about is saving money and keeping the forestry workforce down. Ironically, you'd think the government wouldn't be for that, but if you look at their policies, that's the effect of what they believe in, is to cut down on employment and reduce the number of people that can get livelihoods out of our forests. Believe it or not, that's the end result of a lot of these work safe requirements of getting people into machines, for instance, the hand fallers and the buckers. The government doesn't like that. WorkSafe doesn't like that. They want to get them into enclosed cabs on machines, and of course the productivity is exponentially more, and there's going to be way less jobs by having everybody in machines, right? Because there's just too much efficiency in that. But part of the government's role here, I think, is to take a step back and say, okay, it might cost a little bit more money to use these kind of other methods, but why don't we just allow more deciduous? Why don't we just, this totalitarian mindset that we're applying to our forests, where everything has to, like 95% of every single cut block in our area has to be conifer dominated. Like they just need to lay off that idea. That's an idea of like 2 centuries ago that we developed in Germany to simplify revenues for the king. Nothing's changed since that time as far as how we figure out how we think about reforestation in this province. And just I alluded to earlier there about some of the big corporations are starting to think differently. And there's a really cool video that we posted on the Stop the Spray BC page there. I don't know if you saw that. Jeff Mycock, he is the chief forester of West Fraser and British Columbia operations. I think he's based out of either Quesnel or Williams Lake. And I think he's an interior kid. Like I think he's from here because he says stuff that makes way too much sense for him to be from Vancouver, And so basically he did this presentation with the Canadian Institute of Forestry. It's on YouTube, and it kind of languished there, and somebody brought it to my attention, and he just destroys the whole premise of modern reforestation. Like we're basically making fire traps. That's what we're doing. That's what he admitted. He's like the whole, if you look at our forests, like we don't have the diversity out there to deal with a changing climate, whatever that's going to look like. He's saying that we're basically making fire-prone forests. And it's not super direct about the deciduous connection, but he's like, he hints at it pretty blatantly. So he says, we got to look at the trees that we're suppressing. Okay, what are we suppressing? The aspen and the birch and the cottonwoods. And then he talks about, and he uses it as a question at the very end. That's the very last point in his presentation. Maybe we need more deciduous, he says. You know, and he kind of couches that in some disclaimers, saying that that's not really. He's not saying that's exactly what needs to be done, just a question. But I think the message is obvious when you tie that in with the rest of his presentation. Our forests are we're setting them up for failure. Mm-hmm. The way we're doing these plantations of just spruce and pine trees. It's just obvious to everybody that lives in our area. Like, just drive out there in the bush and see what we're doing. It's madness. So yeah, that's the other part of it, is like, we could allow more diversity, get rid of the glyphosate, do things like sheep, manual brushing. There'd be more work involved anyway, but with the same budget, right? So say they only want to spend 10 million a year on silviculture. You're going to get way more jobs if you use that $10 million on sheep and brushing, as opposed to hiring an expensive helicopter from the Lower Mainland to come up and spray everything. And you're supporting chemical companies in China and, yeah, mostly Chinese offshore glyphosate manufacturers with our tax dollars.
Yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it?
No. And they won't listen to it. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Didn't cut you off.
Just kind of steering it then to this question of, well, the direction of the province then. So you'd mentioned that, of course, Kevin Falcon has put in his name for the BC Liberal leadership. We've spoken on this show many times with Ellis Ross. That's kind of the person we've been talking to the most. I'm sure at some point we'll bring on Mr. Falcon. But I mean, you've got center stage now, and you're up first. What do you have to say about the policies thereof and the direction you think he would try and take the province if he became premier?
I think he'd be a terrible mistake. I have no idea why this guy's getting the airplay that he's getting. I think the BC Liberals will make a huge mistake to elect him as leader. I think Ellis Ross would be a way better leader, especially for the North. I mean, just look at the forestry stuff that Kevin Falcon did. He, if we can pin those things on him, I mean, he was Minister of State for deregulation when they got rid of appurtency, right? So he led to all those policy movements led to the direct closure and destruction of our forest industry in Prince George. Let's be honest. Like, that's insanity to think this guy would stand up for our interests. After he quit politics, he worked for Anthem Capital, and worked on getting all of this foreign capital pumping into our real estate sector. And that was his big accomplishment after politics. And we look at this guy as somebody to respect, like, or look as a leader. Like, come on, it's not a leader. Well, look what he did when he was Minister of Transportation. Okay, all he focused on was getting port expansion. Port expansion is nothing but a handout to offshore manufacturers. Okay, anytime a port is expanded, it makes imports cheaper and undercuts the local producers in our country. And that was his priority, right? And then the other, as far as exporting stuff, it's all dedicated to exporting unrefined raw resources, coal and those kinds of things. So, I mean, those policies were, for me, politically, I want to see a leader who wants to build our economy on things that we build, self-sustainability, manufacturing here in Canada. Those are the values that I look for. And those are the things I want to see a leader kind of prioritize. Kevin Falcon didn't do that, right? He's all about handing our country over to offshore global capital interests. That's what he's about. And that's what he clearly pursued when he was, working for these big global capital guys dumping money into our real estate. Oh, I could go on and on. I know a fair bit about Kevin Falcon because back in the 2000s, I was, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I was a researcher in the legislature for the NDP when they were in opposition. And, we would look at, our job was to criticize the BC Liberals of the day. I'm not an NDP anymore, right? So I consider myself nonpartisan. I can dish out on both parties equally.
And I maybe for fairness sake, we should kind of pivot to the fact that John Horgan has not been the green guy that he marketed himself as. Our current premier has actually increased subsidies to fossil fuels. At least if Stuart Parker is being accurate there, I assume he is. He knows his stuff. And then if we talk about the old growth forests and that sort of thing, I think there's signs going up now about how old growth should be protected. So clearly, John Horgan isn't exactly Mr. Green New Deal.
Well, this will be the challenge for the BC Liberals, is that basically the NDP has taken their position politically, right? So, I mean, the NDP is the new BC Liberals. I don't see any difference.
No argument here.
I mean, maybe I'd say the only differences are probably friendlier to the unions, the big unions that got them into power and donated the money. That's probably, the only reliable thing about the NDP is that they'll always make sure that their union buddies come out on top. And I think that's why, Site C happened, which is a terrible mistake. Probably also why the old growth stuff is because they want to keep their union, the dwindling number of employees that are still in those forestry unions, to keep them employed, right? And cut down the last of the old growth so that nobody has any work and that environmental tourism suffers and all this stuff. So yeah, I mean, that'll be the challenge for any of the leaders who take over the BC Liberals, is that Horgan has basically pulled the rug out from under them as far as their bread and butter, right? I mean, they want to hand out, do these big corporate handouts. Well, John Horgan beat them to the punch.
Smart. So, I mean, they just take your opposition's stuff, right, and run with it. It's just brilliant. Yeah,
this is why it's so, I get so depressed by politics, is because it's so easy to play that game. Like, I don't know, just the way our society is that if you just give everything to like maximum exploitation, and if the more irresponsible you are with the environment, the more popular you are in society. Like, I will never understand what's wrong with us, like why we think like that, but that's the sad reality, and I refuse to accept that's the way it has to be. I still think that humanity can show self-restraint, and I think we can do politics differently with respect to our environment, and not have to destroy it to do things that benefit everybody. And I would argue that this low value raw commodity export model that all this stuff is based on isn't in our interest. Okay, it isn't to our benefit. We're just shipping all of this stuff away. Like, there's no jobs in any of this. Like 600, I don't know, I just saw a statistic on Facebook, so I don't know how accurate it is, but you see those big ships, 600 loads of logging trucks are shipped out every day on these ships. And I don't know, that doesn't sound unreasonable. Like, those are huge ships full of logs. And we're shutting mills down, so and if you do policy like that, like that's what people want. I don't get it, Nathan. I don't know what the disconnect is or how we've come to this juncture, but I mean, we're just going to take everything till it's all gone, I think. And all of these leading politicians who get the most play, like Kevin Falcon, he just wants more of it. Right, that's what he stands for. He wants to cut the taxes for the richest people, the 1%. He wants to probably cut more regulations. Like that's his whole bread and butter. That's what he thinks will get him elected, and he's probably right. It's really sad, but that's why I'm on your show, and that's why I get to say things like that, because you need somebody to point all this stuff out.
And I really enjoy it. And I mean, it's one of the reasons why we bring on Darcy Reppin from the BC Rural Party. And of course, we bring on Stuart Parker. I myself, of course, call myself a conservative. I'm a Tory through and through. How closely aligned that is federally anymore is a different question. But it's funny because my show is dominated with people who don't necessarily come on the same side as I do. But that's not the point, right? The point is to have a real conversation. And these are real issues in British Columbia. And I mean, maybe we can even talk to that for a second. I mean, Darcy, unfortunately, is headed up to the Northwest Territories soon, so he can't come and talk to us about the redistricting. But I mean, as if it wasn't bad enough for us in Northern BC, now they're talking about taking some of our seats away. And now what voice are we going to have to voice some of these opinions? Even if you did get elected tomorrow, I mean, you're one of 2 MLAs instead of 5. Like, where's our representation?
Well, Nathan, I think we've got to start the rebellion of the North, I think, is what needs to happen. You can set your checkpoint up out there in Beaverly, we're north of town, and we'll start the Republic of Prince George. I think that's all there is to it. I'd propose we put an aspen tree on the flag, though.
An aspen tree. I do like aspen trees. I think the thing is that, I mean, the best name for us was already stolen by those silly little islands in the South Pacific. Not to the Pacific Islanders, we love you, but the name was taken. New Caledonia was taken, so we didn't get to be Caledonia. That's what we were supposed to be called, but instead we became British Columbia. It's funny.
I always liked Laidley. I kind of think we should have stuck with that name. The traditional First Nations. Well, it's Laidley Tene, but I don't know. Laidley's kind of a nice, simple version. I don't know. That's kind of a pretty name.
Yeah, it is. It is. I think that it's, again, my thought on this has evolved over time. If I can wax philosophical for a second, I used to probably have a much more kind of pro-colonial stance on those questions, or trying to pivot back to an old understanding of kind of the colonial relationship between First Nations and non-Indigenous people, despite being a First Nations person myself. But I've now come around to the idea that the fact of the matter is, if Western sovereignty is going to happen at all, let alone individual sovereignty or Northern British Columbian assertion of its rights, it has to be based in a narrative that the First Nations can agree with and support and feel partnered with. So I figure that actually maybe we won't get to have, every little kind of, I don't know, at one point I used the diocesan map of the Catholic Church to redivide Canada because it made a lot more sense and it isolated all the metropolitan areas. But nonetheless, if I have to rename every area after the tribal name for it, like, I'll swing with that as long as it means I get more autonomy here at home. Because what seems to be going on is that everybody in Victoria, Edmonton, Winnipeg, and Ottawa, they don't care about us, and that needs to stop.
Oh, absolutely. Well, a good example is this 10-year contamination of the forest with this glyphosate. I wrote a pretty decent press release, I thought. And I mean, this is a story, as far as I'm concerned. I shopped it around to all the major media guys down in Vancouver. I didn't get a single bite. I got the Rocky Mountain Goat, which is out of Valemount. Yeah, they'll be doing a story, but actually the scoop on that was Peter Ewert here in town with Stand Up for the North Committee and the PG Daily News. So good on them. They published that, and Peter said that I don't have the numbers in front of me. I think it got over 60,000 shares from their website, and he said that's one of the most popular stories that they've had in a while. So it's not that it's an unpopular story; it's that the big media guys down in the Lower Mainland don't care about us. Okay, so if 99% of the spraying that happens in Central Interior is in Prince George, doesn't affect them. Who cares, right? And also, they don't really want to be confronted with the side effect of their domination of us economically, right? I mean, if you, and I know Stuart likes to talk about these theories, and I'm sure you do too. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with like the hinterland metropolitan thesis?
Yeah, I call us the hinterland all the time. I hate that we're just the hinterland to them. It's terrible.
terrible idea. But Innes, that was Harold Innes's theory about the development of Canada. From the fur trade to the railroads, and basically the vast north is always kind of a subset of whatever metropolitan area is connected to it. And I think it's a great explanation for what happens up here.
Mm-hmm.
Like Canfor, their head offices, that's not in Prince George, it's in Vancouver, right? All of their big wigs down there. You can email them. They might not write back to you. They don't care about us, right? I mean, how do you get through to these guys? They have some lackeys up here that do what they're told and have no authority. And they probably feel terrible about themselves, but they've got no choice. Right? They can't get through to Vancouver. And besides that, we're just one little small part of Canfor's empire. They've got, a far-flung business model, from Sweden to the southern US to northern BC. So, yeah, I think it just really explains a lot of what's happening. And we got to, Prince George, we have to start being more of the metropolis. And I think we kind of were at one point, with all the mill jobs we used to have, and all the mill owners were in Prince George. And that's why we had the most millionaires per capita in Canada at one point, was because we owned our local resources. And the production of those resources was located in our town. And then as those things got bought out, all of that ownership went elsewhere. So if it went one direction, it can, theoretically, you can go back the other way, Nathan. So we got to make it happen somehow, buddy. I don't know how. I think we need to stop looking at the BC Liberals and the NDP, and I think we need to work on our own political establishment up here. I think that's why Darcy's ideas are so good with the rural party of BC, is I think he brings those issues in, and I don't really know how we can make that effective, but maybe we can. Who knows?
Well, I mean, and Stuart has looped all of us in on something, including Aaron Eckman. We'll have him on the show tomorrow morning as well, and then Stuart on in the second half. I'm not sure if Aaron and Stuart will be on at the exact same time. They're both busy, but Stuart's definitely looped us all in on this question of trying to organize around this, especially when it comes to the redistricting and the boundaries, as that kind of being the touchstone and the moment to kind of to come together as a coalition, because whatever else our values might be, the fact of the matter is nobody thinks it's okay to have our voices eliminated from the legislature, especially when there's more than enough seats going into the Lower Mainland. They're going to increase it by 6. That's enough. If that keeps happening every couple of years, that's fine, but they shouldn't eliminate voices from the North. It's complete nonsense.
Yeah. Well, I also think that we probably agree on a lot more than Twitter, or a lot of people really like to focus in on division, right? And they like to divide people. And I don't really identify with the Conservative Party, but I definitely identify with certain values that they claim to have. As far as being a free market, believers of the free market and competition, and having those kind of things in our economy. I absolutely 100% believe that, but I don't really think that the BC Liberals or the Conservatives actually believe that. Okay, if you're going to be captured by the biggest corporations that don't stand up for the free market, that are the exact opposite of the free market, then you're not a true conservative in my books. So I think we need to find those kind of unifying ideas and come together on those, and we all believe in a community and being nice to each other, and let's not be dicks to each other. I think that's a fairly simple principle that we can all agree on, and let's come together as a people and move forward. And all of these labels and stuff, I find that they divide people, and I think the real metric is, do they look out for the interests of our community, or are they looking out for the interests of these massive corporations that have nothing to do with our community? And you don't have to be a lefty or a conservative or whatever to be on the right side of that question.
No, I completely agree. Maybe something we can kind of pivot to then, James, is to talk a little bit about what would that more nationalized economy look like, or certainly a more localized economy. I believe, there used to be all these mills around Prince George before the amalgamation that happened in the 60s. And ever since then, it's only ever gotten tighter and tighter and tighter. I don't know if are we talking about going all the way back to like 2-man sawmills everywhere, or are we talking about trying to do more of a co-op sort of model when it comes to local sawmills? What would a localized, nationalized, pro worker, pro family forestry economy look like when it comes to those things?
Yeah, I think about this stuff a lot, because that's I build, like, I'm really at the bottom tier of this kind of economy. I do, for the last 10 years, I've run a woodworking shop, and I go to craft fairs, and bring my wares. It's almost like medieval type era stuff, where you load up all your stuff and then haul it to the craft fair in a wagon and do your you do a week-long sale there. I did that at the convention center in Vancouver at the Circle Craft, and I went all the way to Toronto 1 year there selling my stuff. And I make knives, I do some steel work, I do cutting boards, I do furniture, and a lot of the wood I use is sourced entirely locally, right? So I try to integrate the whole, vertically integrate the corporate model, Steidle woodworking. But no, it's just, me and a sawmill and a couple of logs, and mill that up and dry it out. And the steel, I get in sheets from somewhere in Europe, they won't tell me where, of knife steel, and I cheat, right? I use modern technology, so water jet cut out the knife profiles, and And so I think there's ways to really increase our local manufacturing of everything using new technologies. Why are all of our tools made offshore? You go in a Canadian Tire, like what's made in Canada anymore? What's made in America? Like nothing. And we're so useless that we can't build our own tools. Like this should be one of the most basic things that a society should be able to do is produce its own tooling, right? Because if we can't produce our own tooling, then we're screwed for everything else, right? We can't develop industrial infrastructure if we don't have the means to make all that stuff. So we got to start at a very small level and build up. I mean, I buy aluminum for stuff when I build aluminum. Why is our aluminum made offshore? Like, how come I never see a made in Canada square tube aluminum product? That aluminum probably comes from Kitimat, right? So we refine it and make the ore, or take the ore and make a raw ingot aluminum in Kitimat, and then we send that somewhere else, and then we buy it back. Steel. How come we don't have a steel manufacturer in British Columbia? We don't even make our own steel. Like we've got a lot of power that we could use. We could do non-coal steel manufacturing, with electric furnaces and stuff. A lot of other little countries do that. Like, why don't we do that? Why are we importing steel? And then it gets to the point where if you have a shortage, we can't even get it because we're, low man on the, if there is a shortage somewhere, do you think we're going to get prioritized for that steel shipment? That's going to be somewhere else. So these are the kinds of things that we need to develop. And I don't know let's have a small steel mill in Prince George. How hard is that? And if there's cheaper steel from somewhere else, then we need to put taxes on those imports. Why are we bending over backwards to make it easier for these imports to come in off the boats at the ports? Why is Kevin Falcon allowed to brag about that was his greatest accomplishment, was to make all these imports cheaper? Like, buddy, you're screwing over Canada. That's what you did. That's what he did by supporting that. So we need a total paradigm shift in how we look at policies and transportation and shipping and ports and tariffs and all that stuff. So I'm a big dreamer. Obviously, I've got. I think all this stuff is possible. I'm an optimist in that sense. I'm pessimistic about some things, but I think the entrepreneurial power of the population, of the average person, is enormous. And like we always think that we need these big corporations to solve our problems. Like that's ridiculous. They don't solve our problems, folks. Like they make the problems. They steal our resources and they hoard all the wealth to themselves. Like Jimmy Pattison is how many billions of dollars are richer as a result of this pandemic? And you see the big media in Vancouver, like Keith Baldry loves Jimmy Pattison. You see him on Twitter. He basically worships the guy. That's a whole other question about the independence of the media down there. But we have to look at things differently. We have to put trust and faith in the average person to solve problems and to develop a new economy.
One of the things that occurred to me some time ago, for a time I was interested in getting for a time they were called P14. They were, of course, based off the Enfield Action, but they were a beefed up version, overcompensating even compared to the Mauser. This was built for the First World War. They were handed out in both wars, but not enough of them were made in order to see really frontline action. They were used as sniper rifles and home guard weapons. And so, but they're these beefed up, they were in 303, of course, 303 British, but they're these beautiful looking guns, the beautiful looking rifles. I always thought, like, if we could get a hold of the tooling, because the tooling's got to be somewhere. I always thought, like, there could be these kind of a redone version of them, probably in a more modern cartridge, like 308 or something else somebody would want. And there could be like actual manufacturing of these beautiful hunting rifles and predator protection rifles here in Prince George. I mean, surely if we can have craft breweries all the way up and down the interior of British Columbia, why can't there be craft, I don't know, gun manufacturers? Well, rifle manufacturers.
Yeah, I've looked into that, Nathan, because my buddy has a CNC lathe. So we're like, I looked into the rules. There's no rule that prevents you from manufacturing a legal firearm. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, and if anybody's listening to the show, there you go. It's don't worry about the gun laws. You're allowed to make rifles, as long as it's a non-prohibited weapon or rifle. And you can let's get going. Let's start building these things. Yeah, I threw that idea to my buddy. He's got a CNC lathe. I mean, that would be an awesome idea. I'd buy one.
Yeah.
And I think we can do it. There used to be old firearm manufacturers in Canada that have shut down, and that tooling probably all got bought up by someone overseas who's making them and selling them back to us now. And all these old tools, all this old cast iron stuff, like we got to keep our hands on that. And it's still out there, it's still being sold, and I don't know why all this stuff is being let go. Like, yeah,
I remember someone being so interested. This was interesting. When I was up in Churchill, Manitoba. Of course, they're at the edge of the world, so they needed to have their own machine shops. They have a lathe, and they had a bender and everything else, and they had a machinist there who was their machinist for like 50 years, right? Like he was the man who made all the parts for everything, and because they were at the edge of the world, they couldn't fly it in. If they needed it now, they needed it today, right? And he cared about his job so much that he actually, after he retired, had this little lathe. It was a shed that's smaller than the studio I'm in right now. The square footage of the shed was literally like maybe 10 by 12 at best. And in there he had a little lathe and a bender and a drill press. Like he had all this stuff figured out. Like, and he had passed some years before. And my employer had purchased it in an estate sale, and he was bringing it all into his shop, which is still stationed in Churchill. And so it's still in the community, and people will have access to it. Now it's in a more usable space, but it just like, this was so important. Like, if people had just taken that stuff and shipped it out of town, you can bet that 5 minutes after it left on the train, people have been like, I need this done, or I need that done. Like, why do we just give away these things that are so important to both our society and to our heritage? I don't understand.
Yeah. Well, Prince George, you got a good position where actually we have quite a lot of machine shops in town. My dad was a machinist here in town from the 70s onwards, and that was kind of one of the cool things about Clear Lake. Not to go off on tangents here, but that's one of the mills that Canfor shut down. That's where I grew up. There, basically, there's a little trailer park there, and we had a trailer there. We lived there part time when I worked at the mill later on, and. My dad was a machinist, and he got a job there just as a millwright. But as they were building stuff, he's like, well, I could machine this and save a trip in the town. So Clear Lake developed its own little machine shop. And that was our competitive advantage, is that nobody else had a full machine shop like what Clear Lake had. And man, we could run that mill. Basically, all you ever had to buy was ball bearings, saw blades, and some steel. And then we could manufacture everything else. So a lot of the production stuff was all built in-house. Anything that broke, like almost anything, we'd fix right there. We built production line stuff to get around the softwood lumber agreement. So Clear Lake was one of the cheater mills. I don't know if you remember, this is kind of an interesting story of the history of the softwood lumber agreement, but my dad and his buddies there, they built a tool that would drill holes through every 2x4 on the production line. And that was so, for construction, you could run your wires through those holes when you built your stud frame for housing. And so now it became a manufactured product, and it was no longer subject to the softwood lumber agreement. So then the Clear Lake pioneered that, and then of course all the other mills copied us, and we were shipping loads of wood through the loophole in the agreement and made a bunch of money. And that was all because we had our own machine shop and some clever guys there that thought about this kind of stuff. And Clear Lake was never an efficient mill, right? It was the most inefficient mill in British Columbia. Every single board was touched by a human hand multiple times. We had when Canfor closed it down in 2010, it had 364 employees in total. And that included everybody in the office. It had its own office, its own payroll department, all that stuff. Even when Canfor purchased it, it was entirely self-functioning business enterprise, like right down to the people that wrote the checks and all that. And we only ever produced 120,000 board feet a shift, which is peanuts. It's nothing. To put that in perspective, Polar, the super mill in Bear Lake, they do 1.2 million board feet a shift. So that's 10 times the production. So we had a mill that hired 364 people that produced 1/10 the lumber of Bear Lake, and it still made money. It made money till the day it shut down. Probably a lot to do with how cheap it was to run and how we were self-sufficient, how we made all of our own parts and rebuilt everything ourselves. And I think that's kind of a great metaphor for how we could run society. We don't need the most efficient society. I think we just need to be self-sufficient and keep the money in-house. And that's how you build wealth. And I think we need to look at things a little differently like that, because, sure. So Buddy sets up a gun shop in Prince George and manufactures a rifle. It's cheaper to buy something that's made in China. But that money, if you buy the made in Prince George rifle, all that money just stays in the community, right? And then that person, they can buy some other, and if everybody kind of lives by the same ethic, then they can support their own community, and all that money stays in the town. Our wealth and we all become better off that way. It's when people start defecting to the cheapest thing that is offshore. That's when we start to impoverish ourselves. And that's basically the model of our entire economy. And I think we're seeing, and that's we're seeing the impact of this gradually, like all the homelessness. People can't afford homes anymore. Like, you think that's just because people are like, why didn't we have homeless people 30 years ago in Prince George? There was one homeless guy in town, and they left the post office door open, and he could sleep where the mailboxes were. That's what he did all winter. That was it. Like, there was nobody on the street when it was cold out in Prince George when I was a kid. And if they were, they had a place. The government left the door open for them to sleep. That's what I remember. And now we have the whole downtown is full of homeless people. Like, is that just because people have changed? No, the economy's changed. The society has changed. The will for people to work and support the society is evaporating, because the society and the system we've built is only out for big money and big capital, and the fat cats, it's not out for the average Joe. That's what's happening. And that's why we need to change things and stand up for ourselves up here, and maybe we can turn it around and make a model for the rest of the country.
There's a guy I follow on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter anymore. They've tried to convince me to go back. I'm not interested in going back. But there's a guy I follow on Facebook who puts his tweets on Facebook too, and that's Not a Wolf, Dan Sheehan, a kind of left of center sort of guy, populist sort of guy, very neoliberal, the policies that shipped all our raw resources away and destroyed manufacturing. And the other day he made the point of, there's this poster up somewhere, some motivational poster in some office somewhere, like, diamonds, coal has to be crushed into diamonds, grapes have to be crushed into wine. When the pressure comes down, that's just life making you better. And he's like, this is the thing. I'm not a grape. I'm a person. Yeah, that's what we're supposed to do with our workers. It's like, it's all about mindfulness, man. Well, I mind that I'm not being paid enough. I don't understand.
Yeah, I mean, there's an attractive part of that argument, right? That if you make a hard life makes us stronger, right? That's kind of, I think, what these big corporations want us to believe. And the argument that, well, all these mills got shut down in Prince George because we were asking too much money for wages. Like a mill worker expects $30 an hour in Prince George, and they pay a mill worker minimum wage in the US South. So we deserve to lose all our jobs, right? I get it. I get why people think that's an attractive argument, sort of. But at the same time, that's what the market bears, right? If you have a competitive market, those high wages were the result of a competitive market. And if you don't have a competitive market anymore, yeah, they can whittle your wages down. And by that, I mean, if you have a single company dominating your town, then the mill worker doesn't have anywhere else to go. And yeah, then then the big company will be in a position to grind you out and to reduce your wage and make life harder for you and better for them. Right. And I think that's a lot of these questions and philosophical sort of, arguments can be resolved with a properly functioning competitive economy, and where you do have competition, where antitrust laws are enforced. And Canada is just going the opposite direction. Like, it's just crazy. one of the great American presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, he was a Republican, and one of his most important policy accomplishments was hammering down on these huge monopolies. The big steel interests, the big coal interests, the big railroad interests. Like, that was a huge deal 100 years ago. People knew that was a problem then. Why isn't it a problem now? Why are we allowing all this stuff to happen? It's not just Canfor and West Fraser. It's also TELUS and these internet companies and Amazon and the Costco's of the world, Walmart, Save On grocery store in town. It's like they dominate. Every single mid-sized grocery store in Prince George is run by one company. There's no competition. And if you consider the Superstore is kind of the only competition to Save On, and that's also a huge company that basically runs a monopoly, right?
Well, bless, yeah.
So personally, I shop at Foothills Foods. I recommend everybody else support your local grocer, and it costs more, that's for sure, but that money's going back in your community, and you help them, survive. I kind of lost the train of thought, but
that's okay. No. We're getting towards the end of our time here. I was just thinking that just before we have to go, because the pipeline comes on in just a few minutes here. But just before we go, if people want to learn more about Stop the Spray and the issues around forestry, where should they go?
Come to our Facebook page, Stop the Spray BC. There's a group and there's a page. You can join the group or follow the page if that's easier for you. And yeah, there's going to be some press, hopefully, more stuff coming out about this contamination issue. I did an interview with CKPG yesterday. Nice. So there might be some coverage there on tomorrow, possibly. There might be a little bit of a broadcast on that stuff. So I think the word's getting out about the glyphosate thing. And yeah, I guess we kind of veered off that topic a little bit today, but it was awesome to do the show with you, Nathan. Hopefully we can do it again. And
No, it's been great having you, James, and we enjoy having you every time. It's awesome.
Okay, well, right on. We will see you again, I guess, and I don't know what else to say. We should do a show. Maybe we should do a northern, some kind of northern separation show with maybe Aaron on there and Darcy, and
yeah, we'll get all of us on. And we'll do a round table. You know what? That's not a bad idea at all. I'll look for where that would fit into, say, June, because Darcy's not coming back till the end of June. So maybe we'll try for that.
Right on. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. You take care, Nathan.
Thank you, James.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Of course, that was James Steidle of Stop the Spray, British Columbia, and he was talking to us about the nature of phosphate spray and how that works and the problems thereof. I think that kind of as a final bit of words from me here, we do have to get off a little bit earlier than we did yesterday because, of course, they want us off about 5 minutes before the pipeline begins. So that's at 10:55 Pacific, 11:55 Mountain. They'll be on at noon, obviously, Mountain, and 11 Pacific. But the point is that as a final summary for me, I think that just as we were talking with Dr. Havers earlier, just talking to James now, ultimately things are changing in this country. And it's not changing in the elites. It's not changing up top there, except that they're getting more tyrannical and more selfish and more greedy and more insane, and probably incestuous, if we're being honest. The point is that it's not changing up there. It's just getting worse in the ways that it was always bad up there. But down here below, where the common man lives, I think that there is a sense of solidarity building, and it's crossing partisan lines, it's crossing ethnic lines, cultural lines, religious lines, even orientation lines, as we can see with people agitating against the whole transgender thing, that for when it comes to minors, when it comes to children, and what's gotten very out of hand there. And we had, of course, Chris Elston on the show earlier, and we'll have Chris Elston again. But as a final point for me, I think that, again, we come back to this issue of solidarity. And if we can cross all these separating lines, these things that separate us from each other, we can overcome what the elites are doing. And we can actually make for a better world. Whether that world looks exactly like the borders of Canada as they do now, whether it looks like the borders of British Columbia as they do now, let alone the rest of the West and the rest of Canada, I think that there's a clear line. There's a clear line. People are growing tired of the deal that they're getting. They're being rubbed raw, and and they feel like they're getting robbed blind, if we're looking for some alliteration there. And that's not going to stand for much longer. The lockdowns haven't helped. The issues with COVID haven't helped. The housing prices haven't helped. People are feeling left behind. And this can't go on. So hopefully that solidarity grows. We will look forward to that show probably in a month's time or so, where we do discuss what would it look like, a BC first, a northern BC first, a local BC first sort of political organization and a agenda that would achieve that. So that's all for me. This was Mountain Standard Time. I'm your host, Nathan Gita. We'll be on bright and early tomorrow, 9 a.m. Pacific, 10 a.m. Mountain. Aaron Ekman starts off the show with us, and we'll have Stuart Parker come on in the second half. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a great day.